Yves Giroux and his colleague Christopher Penny to launch our study. It is pursuant to a motion taken by this committee on April 21st that we begin studying the impacts of Canada's procurement process on the Canadian Armed Forces. And I'm looking forward to the PBO's analysis, and we appreciate your appearance here today. With that, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We are pleased to be here to discuss our analysis related to your study of the impact of Canada's procurement processes on the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces. With me today, I have our lead on the defense file, advisor analyst and eminent Christopher Penny.
In accordance with the PBO's legislative mandate to provide impartial, independent analysis to help parliamentarians fulfill their constitutional role, which consists of holding government accountable, my office has published the following recent reports related to your study: the life cycle cost of the Canadian surface combatants, a fiscal analysis; Canada's military expenditure and the NATO 2% spending target; the industrial and technological benefits policy, an analysis of contractor obligations and fulfillment; and planned capital spending under strong, secure, engage, Canada's defense policy. In the coming weeks, we are also planning to release an independent cost estimate of the F-35 fleet, as well as an analysis of the defense force structure model. Christopher and I would now be pleased to respond to any questions you may have regarding our defense analysis or other PBO work. Thank you.
Thank you. So witnesses should always be this economical with their opening remarks. So Ms. Nyman, 6 minutes, please.
Excellent. Thank you for your brief testimony. I'm sure we'll get into some questions here from all of the respective parties. My first question, in the PBO's 2022 report titled Planned Capital Spending Under Strong, Secure and Engaged Canada's Defence Policy, 2022 Update, it states that the capital spending from 2023-2024 through until 2027-2028 potentially raises questions regarding the ability of the government to manage increased procurement activity. Could you possibly speak of any recent progress the government has made towards ensuring procurement problems do not arise when they dial up defense spending over this period?
Sure. So when we released that report, we indicated that the government was underspending compared to its planned capital expenditure under strong, secure, and engaged to the tune of about $8 billion over a 4-year period, which led to a shortfall of about $2 billion per year. And the government has, at that point when we released our report, had revised its capital expenditures to make up for that shortfall. With respect to whether we have more information, I'll let Christopher answer that part of the question.
The only thing I would add is that we know that in 22-23 there was a shortfall as compared to planned SSE spending of about $1.5 billion in capital, and 23-24 present fiscal year, the main estimates suggest that the shortfall will be about $4 billion. So there was over $10 billion planned spending under SSE for 23-24, and only 6 was asked for in the main estimates. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So I understand that there are excessive project specifications and that they're a major factor with regards to the timeline that we see for many defense procurement projects. Would you be able to explain how we could speed up things by eliminating unnecessary specifications?
So it's a delicate issue because we're not military experts when it comes to the needs of the Canadian forces. And it's difficult for us to determine whether these specifications are excessive or not. We can, however, provide general statements or general observations when it comes to defense procurement. So there's clearly no single point of accountability, which may explain the delays in part. So, for example, there are at least 2 ministers and 2 departments involved in major procurement processes. Major procurements are ultimately resting upon political decisions. And there's also contracting approaches that favor industry partners and tend to cede control from the federal government. So when it comes to the specification aspect, there are obviously unique specifications required due to Canadian-specific characteristics, landmass size, and climate, but there could probably be improvements when it comes to specifications that would benefit from being clearly delineated from the get-go as opposed to changing the specifications once the procurement process is launched.
Okay, perfect. So just to take further your response to that, so if the dispersion of responsibilities across several different government departments and agencies, do you agree with the diagnosis that having a single point of ministerial responsibility would contribute to a faster and more efficient procurement process?
It would certainly be a contributing factor and something that would favorably enhance the speed of procurement and the efficiency of the procurement process to have one single minister and one single senior official responsible.
Okay, thank you. Further, with regards to reassignment of authority, it's often been said that the defense procurement is its own beast and therefore it may not be appropriate to assign the responsibility over to PSPC. Do you agree with this characterization? And if so, what department or agency would be most appropriate for managing it? And why do you think that?
That's a question that I don't think I'm in the best position to answer as to who should be responsible. I think as long as there is one organization or minister or senior official that is ultimately responsible with the right skill set and the right support structure behind them, that would be appropriate, whether it be PSPC or National Defense or even somebody else. I don't think is material or matters that much as long as they have the right skill set and the appropriate structure to support them.
Okay, thank you. I'm good for your time. Okay, next question. In the PBO's 2022 report titled The Industrial and Technological Benefits Policy, an analysis of contractor obligations and fulfillment, it stated that the ITB policy affects the outcome of a competitive procurement process and that a supplier that proposes lower value for money or a higher price could still be awarded a multi-million-dollar contract if it promises greater economic benefits to Canada. So in your view, does the eventual ITB benefits generally exceed the extra costs?
Again, it's a value judgment that is a bit difficult to make or to decide upon because there are reasons why the ITBs have been put in place. One would need to look at the counterfactual to determine whether, in the absence of ITB, what would be the price and what would be the economic benefits. What we have found, though, and what's surprising to us, is that even if there are multipliers that reduce the dollar requirements for ITB investments for corporations in post-secondary education, for example, or research and development, very few of these, of the value of these contracts go towards the higher multiplier effect, which suggests that the ITB may not be working fully as intended when it comes to multiplying the economic impacts in these high-value sectors such as post-secondary education and research and development.
Thank you, Ms. Graham-Newman. Mr. Fisher, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for the important work that you do every day, ironing out all of the wrinkles of the way government works or sometimes doesn't work. And you may have touched on some of this with Ms. Cramp-Nyman, but I'm thinking about the layers of policies, thinking about the layers of process, especially with defense procurement. How can we, and I guess I'm looking for specific recommendations, how do we streamline? How do we get more agile? I mean, I know we can do procurement of a baseball hat pretty well, but when it gets to really big things, then we have multiple departments within government all looking at defense procurement specifically. How do we streamline? How do we get more agile and responsive to our incredible military requirements?
So it's an interesting question because we start from a base where there's a small defense industrial base in Canada compared to other countries. So right there, we're at a disadvantage, especially if we insist on having Canadian-made major equipment. And the government, obviously, for various reasons, often insists on domestic production. So that severely limits the competitive base on which the government can tap. So a small industrial defense base, that's one disadvantage. But there are ways, I think, of overcoming, at least in part, this disadvantage, notably by having one single point of contact when it comes to defense procurement, not just a point of contact, but a point of accountability. Right now, there's at least two departments involved, Defense and PSPC. So that would be one way to simplify things, having one person and one organization ultimately accountable for military procurement. There are obviously ways to simplify the procurement process, but I think specialists in procurement could be better placed to explain in details how to streamline the procurement process.
How do we balance competition while still seeking speed and also acknowledge that we have to be fiscally responsible?
That requires a delicate balancing act between cost and value for money versus that, and also ensuring that there are significant or measurable economic benefits for the country, while also ensuring, as has been the government's policy for some time now, to develop a domestic defense capability. Because, as has been pointed out to me, it's one thing to procure major equipment from abroad, but in case of war, it doesn't guarantee us that we would be first to be served. We'd probably be at the back of the queue. So there are intangible costs to procuring abroad in case of unforeseen needs. So there is obviously value in having a domestic production capacity.
So, speaking strictly with democracies, who does, and not just procurement, but specifically speaking to defense procurement, which democracies are doing it right? And what are they doing differently?
It's difficult to provide a definite, clear answer to that, because if you look at some countries, there are anecdotes that some military departments can buy pens and screws at prohibitively expensive prices, but on the other hand, they're very efficient at producing and putting in waters frigates and so on. So we have some numbers here as to costs. They may not be comparable, but the Arleigh Burke destroyer in the U.S. costs about $2.2 billion U.S. apiece. The South Korean destroyers about $1 billion apiece, and so on, compared to the Canadian surface combatant at over $5 billion Canadian apiece. However, it's not entirely sure that these numbers are fully comparable, because the U.S. and the South Korean numbers may not include all the costs that we include in our own estimates. But there are other countries that do well in some specific areas of procurement. In this case, it's warships.
Do all democracies in defense procurement demand or expect a level of domestic production?
I don't know about that.
In my experience, it seems that almost every country levies some type of program that is similar to the Industrial and Technological Benefits Program. So we generally refer to these as defense offsets, and this is more the norm rather than the exception. So it is something we see. There is a favoritism towards domestic production. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure, Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to hear you speak on something that was announced in 2019, but it seems to have died as an idea, but it seemed to have garnered some interest is the creation of an entity that would be called Supply of Defense Spending. I understand that this was not part of the mandate letters of the minister, and this was disappointing for someone. Could you talk to us and say what this entity might have been, this defense spending organization? And were you consulted at all? So to answer, no, we were not consulted with this. We didn't see this. We didn't see the appearance of this supply organization in the letters of mandate without having been consulted. I believe it was the creation of a specific agency, and that the idea was that this could solve some issues, and the condition that it would be that supply in the matters of defense could be from this organization. If we add an extra player, all the while leaving an important role to the current department, defense, and this would only add some confusion in the system and add an extra step in the process of supply. So the creation of another agency is not essential, in my opinion, in order to improve the supply process. We could change the cards without adding an extra entity. So I understand that the problem is that there's overlap between the departments. So as long as we eliminate this overlap, it's a step in the right direction. Yes, well, this is what I believe. We don't need to necessarily add another entity. If we do, it has to be that entity that will be solely responsible for purchasing and supply. It would be difficult to have one sole entity responsible if one is added. D&D will want to have its word to say in specifications and contract for obvious reasons. So it doesn't seem to me as being the solution, the magic pill to the problem linked to purchasing and supply. One of the things that other countries do is that they have policies that are decided at the base by officials rather than political requests, with systematic revisions every 2 years. What about taking the politics out of the process and reviewing a request? Is this something that has been considered? This is a model that should be considered because taking out the political level would allow for a more neutral approach to supply. However, there are disadvantages because we know that politicians are elected to represent the desire of the population. And in the field of defense, we have to reflect the will of the people. But this can lead to delays that don't really bring anything fundamental to supply if we think about the decisions made with regards to the F-35, where we're buying a same plane that we could have purchased several years ago with much higher costs. So yes, it's an approach that can be desirable in some cases, but that has to be subject to tight control of the political staff that is responsible for government decisions. Thank you. Mr. Fisher earlier was talking about buying baseball caps, that seems a lot easier than material equipment. But with some articles in the media we saw, well, the military staff were saying that personal material that they receive is oftentimes obsolete. So is this process quick enough when we talk about the end users? Oftentimes this material is not going to be used because it's obsolete by the time the military staff gets it. So this question should be better asked of the department, and especially to the military personnel who are suffering the disadvantages of this current system for purchasing military equipment. I don't have a detail of all the ways that things are purchased. So we also know that there are delays. So do you do studies with regards to the extra cost linked to delays? If you order something, and then we saw this with the pandemic, we saw it in the field of construction, costs are exploding. And so is there a type of follow-up with regards to the delays and the cost increased because of the wait times? We haven't done this systematically. We've done it for major programs. For example, the surface combatants, but we didn't do it for everything. We, other than our reports, this is probably from the part of the mandate of the AG.
Ms. Masson, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you being here, Mr. Giroux and Mr. Penny. Thank you. I know that your report on the new acquisition of the F-35s isn't out yet. So I think maybe we should consider, as we continue on this study, once it's out, that we invite the PBO back. Just a suggestion. But I wanted to ask, you have sent this letter to the Minister of National Defence on January 16th, asking to do that examination of true costs. Now, your predecessor, Kevin Page, did the same thing on the sole source contract that the Conservatives had done on the F-35s. And at the time, it was discovered that D&D actually kept 2 books on the costs of the F-35s. And they were tricky in terms of how they estimated the lifespan, and that reduced overall the costs of what was estimated on each of the aircraft acquired or were supposed to be acquired. So obviously, we don't want that to happen again. We don't want those same tricks. So from what you've received thus far, can you comment at all on if you've seen anything like that or if we should be concerned?
What we have seen so far does not lead to concerns of that nature, of what we've seen several years ago. We have received very good collaboration from the Department of National Defense. There have been some hiccups, information that we had asked earlier this year that did not exist and then that now exists, but I think that was just an oversight. So nothing major, and we're confident that what we have in terms of information does fully represent the numbers and what D&D is really using. The other advantage that we have compared to several years ago is that we have gained several years of experience, as has the Department of National Defense, in costing that fighter jet. So they've had lots of time to refine the cost estimate, as we say, for various reasons.
Okay. One of the recommendations that you put forward in the ITB report said that National Defense should review its material, forecasting, positioning to ensure sufficient stocks are maintained at the right locations. That was the big issue. The union involved in a lot of that categorizing and maintenance of stocks, that's been privatized over the years. The union is really quite upset about a lot of the privatization and outsourcing of those contracts. Did you find that was part of some of the problems in terms of keeping those stocks?
Well, we didn't look at that, so you may be referring to a report by the Auditor General, because we did not make recommendations. Maybe it's something that I completely forgot, but I don't think so. So we didn't look at the intricacies of the process and the privatization of some processes at National Defense.
Okay. It was also, I think that was an AG report. I apologize.
Maybe Madame Hogan will be a bit insulted that you confuse her with me.
I'm sorry. Yes, I wouldn't want to ever do that. No. Ultimately, you did find, though, that in terms of the procurement process, there's quite a huge gap of specialists that have been hired within National Defense or that can do that job. There's a chronic issue that hasn't seen any resolution in terms of, I think it says 30% or 4,200 positions are unfilled as of May 2022, lacking in trained resources, people able to help with those procurement issues. What do you suggest, or what are you looking at in terms of how the department needs to deal with that, or ultimately what the consequences long term will continue to be, as we've seen thus far?
So we have not looked at specifically the lack of procurement personnel at DND, but in the course of our multiple reports, and we've released a lot over the years, it's something that has come up regularly, that there's a lack of procurement personnel at DND. So in order to improve the procurement process, it's clear that it is an essential part that DND or whoever is ultimately responsible for the procurement process, if there were to be changes made, that they have the appropriate number of persons in place with the right skill set. So a lack of personnel is obviously an impediment to an efficient procurement process.
Right. So those ballooning costs that we keep talking about, that's a huge part of the fact that we just don't have enough people to be able to do the work that's being required of them.
That's a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I wanted to ask as well, when you're analyzing these major procurement projects, how do you integrate social costs into that? So you've talked about the cost of climate change, right, and the impact of that. And how do we, when we're analyzing these major procurement and equipment purchases, how do we keep up with that social costs, climate change, environmental policy, different lenses, an indigenous lens of procurement?
So that's a question that is very that's something that comes up every now and then. And we're a budget office, so we tend to go with dollars and cents and numbers and the cost of specific proposals. Even though there are social impacts and environmental impacts to many of the government's policy proposals, we don't tend to look at these systematically. And in the case of defense procurement, we don't look at these other aspects, generally speaking. And similarly, we don't look at the benefits for Canada to having warships or fighter jets, because these would be difficult to quantify.
Thank you, Ms. Mass and Ms. Gallant. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the NATO 2% of GDP spending, the Wales commitment, apart from the obvious, the equipment, the fuel, the training, deployment, base infrastructure, what other items are included in this calculation that would be different than what had been done previously? What additional items?
That's an interesting question, because I myself looked at that when the issue resurfaced several months ago, and I was myself a bit surprised to hear that, but I should not have been surprised, but there are other elements other than pure D&D spending. For example, veterans' pensions and benefits. Some benefits are included. Some expenditures by the RCMP, some, not all, but a fraction, a small fraction. Spending by the Canadian Coast Guard, because in many countries the Coast Guard is considered a paramilitary force. So Canada is allowed under NATO rules to include expenditures by the Coast Guard, as well as some transfer payments to NATO and other international organizations.
And those are changes made over the last 10 years, or have those always been there?
No, they have not always been there. They were made in
2014, 2015.
Okay. Now, the word is that 2% will become the minimum as opposed to the aspirational 2%, which Canada has taken it to be. Will we reach, or I should say, given the modifications, has the number of things in the percentage, it made it look like our percentage of GDP has been increased?
So yes, as a result of including these additional expenditures, which is consistent across NATO countries, it's not unique to Canada, so it's a NATO definition, the proportion of expenditure of GDP going to defense expenditures has gone up and is expected to go up, but mostly as a result of increased capital expenditures at D&D, but will still fall short of the 2% target or minimum, depending on the wording, depending on who you talk to, and that results in a shortfall of between 18 and $13 billion.
Okay, so there's often the concern that the increase in defense spending goes towards salaries as opposed to capital projects. So what percentage of the budget currently goes towards the capital project specifically?
Should be about 30% at this point.
Okay, and given Canada's slow ability to increase military capabilities, are there currently any ways to require that they maintain a 20% investment in capital projects minimum?
It's a target also under NATO, but it's difficult to reach that level with the current constraints, especially when it comes to delivering on military projects. But over time, with the expected increase in capital spending, that goal could be attained over the next couple of years, assuming that there are no further delays or issues with military procurement.
Okay. Earlier, you mentioned that a single point of responsibility, both at the ministerial and the senior management level, are required to be more efficient in our procurement. What other countries do seem to get procurement right and efficiently, and what, apart from the difference in leadership, what are they doing that perhaps we could be emulating?
So I'm a budget guy, so I've done reports on Canada's military, and I've looked at numbers for other countries, but I'm not a military procurement specialist per se, especially not on the international scene. But maybe Chris, the eminent Chris, has more knowledge and more information than me.
Certainly, yeah. The only two I would point out were the two you pointed out earlier. That would be Japan and South Korea. They seem to be doing quite well. I believe it was recently announced in Poland that they've acquired or entered into an agreement to acquire new tanks and other materiel from South Korea, and they're to be delivered within 6 months. And these are top of the line, next generation quality platforms.
Are there different budgetary procedures that we could follow, better planning procedures in order to get the equipment into the hands of the military more quickly?
I'm not sure that the budget process or the funding process is itself at fault, because there's already a predictable budget track for capital expenditures under Strong, Secure, and Engage. And even before that, there was a capital spending envelope at the Department of National Defense that was highly predictable and that had, for which the government provided flexibility at DND to reprofile it according to its needs. So, in my opinion, having worked on budgets for decades now, the budget process and the funding process itself is not the main element. There's already significant or sufficient, I think, predictability in the DND capital spending, and I don't think that is the main issue.
And with respect to the length of time it takes to get to it from approval, for example, to the actual cutting of the steel, be it for ships, I understand that there's quite a lengthy delay, and a portion of that is with Treasury Board. Is there anything that can be done to speed that up, or are all those procedures, checks and balances necessary and to get it out of the door and into the hands more quickly?
As I said, I think having a single point of contact or single point of accountability would be the ideal scenario, where you have fewer, ideally one agency or department or organization responsible for procurement, including decisions. It doesn't mean we have to forget about the oversight of Treasury Board, but the Treasury Board Secretariat is not populated with military procurement specialists, so their role is essentially to ensure that due process has been followed. So if we can streamline the process and reduce the number of agencies and organizations involved in the military procurement process, it will indeed, I think, facilitate the work of the Treasury Board Secretariat and Treasury Board ministers in ensuring that due process has
Thank
been
you,
followed.
Ms. Gallant. 5 minutes. Ms. Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here today. I want to follow up a little bit on this, on the 2% spending piece, because I wasn't quite sure. I just wanted clarity in your testimony. You mentioned that in 2014-15, the change came in terms of including parts of the Coast Guard veteran salaries. Is that what I understood? That's when Canada started to include those things in their 2% spending?
That's correct.
Okay. And so that was obviously a previous government changing the ability or increasing or bringing in other departments to put in, to increase up to the 2%. There's been lots of testimony and debate around the, reaching the 2%, but we also saw that previously previous to our government, we were not even at 1%. Do you have the dates of percentage and then when they started to increase, let's say going back to 2010?
I don't have it in front of me right now, going back to 2010, but from 2014 we were at 1%, and that's when the change occurred in the definition. I should note that this is a NATO definition, and obviously it comes from them, but it had been the case that you could include these other cost categories for many years before that. It's just that Canada started defining it that way in 2015.
Understandable. I just think the criticisms of, reaching a 2% spending and then without clarifying that one of the ways that a previous government increased their percentage was to actually just include new categories, and it wasn't actually new defense spending. It was a recategorization of putting that spending that was already being done into the 2% spending. In terms of those numbers, though, in terms of the increases, would that be something you could table with the committee? I would just be curious of that progression, say going back from 2010.
NATO publishes those numbers,
Okay,
so they're
perfect.
very easily available.
Perfect, thank you. And in terms of, there were earlier in answering another question, you mentioned that you use the example of, for example, if there was a war, like there might be difficulty then in that time procuring. Well, we're seeing a war right now, the illegal invasion in Ukraine from Russia. And so have you determined any analysis that could be part of the reason for, again, criticisms of spending that has gone unspent? Is it an issue of there's only so many companies or agencies that we would work with in terms of procuring this equipment, and they are probably in high demand right now in certain parts of this world? So has that analysis been done? Is that a factor in some of the unspent?
So we haven't done an analysis of the specific factors behind the lapses at national defense, but we have seen lapses for a number of years now, and they predate the war in Ukraine.
Fair enough. Thank you. And in terms of U.S. procurement, I know you mentioned you look at numbers, but when I was on Finance Committee, we often looked at U.S. military procurement from a finance perspective, in the sense that, for example, the defense in the U.S. would put out a request for tender saying this was an example that was used, so I don't know the details, but this was testimony that was used. Design a gun that can shoot around corners. I'm serious. This is what the testimony was. And what that did was it created this industry of people now developing all this technology. Obviously, it's not a gun that fits, but probably some type of, camera or microscope type thing. But by doing that, because defense spending was so massive in terms of their procurement, that it incentivized companies to come up with all this different technology. And so it's really kind of difficult to compare the U.S. to the Canadian example, because they may never have even used any technology that came out of it. But so much money was spent in even the development of these even ideas that might be wild to us. So are there policies that maybe not as extreme as some of that, but are there policies that Canada could implement that would actually see the development of this sort of technology through our procurement process?
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. It's an important policy question as to whether the PBO can answer a question as to whether a gun will shoot around the corner. Yeah. Yeah. If in fact the PBO comes up with how to shoot a gun around the corner, I think we'll all be interested in that. But that does strike me as a little bit beyond your mandate. With that, I'm going to ask Madame Normandin for 2.5 minutes. But before she does that, Mr. Clerk, I see that the temperature here seems to be exceedingly low. I see people putting clothes on and things of that nature. Oh, okay. Well then, if the temperature is okay, you're probably need a little bit more than just a jacket to look respectable. 2.5 minutes, then, Madame Normandin.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to come back on my question on technological and industrial benefits. One of the things that I heard is that there was a politicization of the benefits, that very broad criteria are implemented, but that this is not necessarily adapted to the needs. So was this highlighted in the PBO's office, and was there a lack of efficiency with regards to these policies and this politicization of the benefits? When we looked at the economic spin-offs and the industrial spin-offs, is that there are a lot of these spin-offs or benefits that are in fields that are indirectly linked. So expenditures that are made that fulfill criteria with regards to dollars spent, but quite a few, very few, allocated to small and medium-sized businesses, and less in research and our research and development, even if businesses that have to respond have a credit going 4 to 9 amounts the amounts invested. So they don't do this very often. This suggests that expenditures that are made to fulfill the criteria for industrial spin-offs are expenditures that would probably be done anyways, or that are not additional money to what would exist in the absence of this policy. So as for localization of these spin-offs, I heard that in the past there was a regional optic. We knew where the money was going, but now it's more difficult to find out. Is this the case? Our study did not look at the regional distribution. I'm not sure if Chris, when he wrote the report, found any regional distribution. No, this was not part of the scope of our report.
2.5 minutes.
Sort of building off of, I think, what Mr. Fisher was asking in terms of how do you balance a speedy delivery with the idea of more of an open process. A lot of small c conservatives talk about the industry needing that competition in order to innovate and so on. But there is that balance of speed and efficiency and so on. So how do you lock down, like how do you as the PBO try and assess that, where money could be saved from sole source, and there's a lot of pressure on government to do that versus the open bid, and then and driving innovation within open bids, but also costs.
So it's a question that calls on many constraints. For example, you can have open competition, you can have value for money or the lowest bid, but it's difficult to meet all of the constraints if you also add domestic production, because Canada has a small industrial defense base. So if the government, or if any government, insists on domestic production, it's very difficult to have sound competition that will also drive down the costs. So the only way to square that circle or would be to say we are willing to go domestic, but if we don't get an accurate or a reasonable price, or if there are cost overruns, we will go abroad and we'll outsource this, or we'll go to foreign suppliers. But then that would be in breach of the domestic production capacity or policy, and that would lead Canada exposed to foreign suppliers in case of a war outbreak that would require significant ramp-up of production.
But within your report itself, I mean, it said that even though there was that policy of going into Canadian companies, the money still went to foreign owners because the majority of the money still went into international hands, right? Because of the way that it's foreign-owned companies sort of take on Canadian contracts or Canadian companies themselves.
We didn't look at where the money went, so we looked at the overall cost of the Canadian surface combatants, for example, and we looked at the overall cost. We didn't look at whether the money was spent domestically or which share was spent abroad.
So as a
The very respectable-looking Mr. Kelly. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Are excessive project specifications, are they a factor in these excessive times that we see and delays in getting projects funded and
That
built?
certainly is a factor. I'm not sure if I can call them excessive, not being a specialist myself of the needs of the Canadian forces. So maybe they're totally justified, but it's clear that we see that in procurement projects, not just defense, but also IT projects, where if you ask the ultimate users, what would you like to have, or what do you need to have, they'll have lots of specifications. It's not clear whether each and every one of them is necessary, but if they become part of the requirements in the contract, they drive up costs, even though not every single one of them might be necessary.
Okay. Now, do you think that Treasury Board, the TBS thresholds are too low for military procurement?
I'm not sure that, to be honest, and I'm taking a risk by saying that I'm not sure that the Treasury Board process adds that much value in terms of military procurement.
You don't think that you're concerned that maybe there should be no threshold and that the TBS should be cut?
What do you mean by threshold at TBS?
For the 50 million or the amount that would engage Treasury Board the TBS process?
Well, I think Treasury Board Secretariat is not equipped with military specialists. So if there are specialists, there are not that many. So I'm not sure that they have the best skill set to be able to push back or to challenge appropriately the requirements of the Department of National Defense or PSPC.
Okay. Is there sufficient competition for military contracts?
For the big ones, like the ones for which we did reports, surface combatants, notably, there is not a lot of competition domestically. So that is one of the issues when the government wants to procure these major major pieces of equipment, and insists on procuring them domestically. It has to help financially with the building of the capacity, which is not the case, for example, in the U.S., where there's already a much bigger base for building these warships in that case.
Okay. Can you explain I mean, it's up to the government, I guess, to explain the having only 6 out of the 10 billion in the estimates, but do you have any way to attribute that shortfall? Is it delays in process, or does it appear to be a conscious decision to not fund strong, secure, and engage, or is it just a matter of delays, or what do you make of that
I wouldn't,
shortfall?
I wouldn't attribute that to a conscious decision. What we've been told is a combination of delays in procuring major projects, the pandemic, which has slowed down many things, and these are the main elements that we've been told.
Specific, or what are the central procedural issues in the system that are causing the delays? Like, what can you pinpoint?
The fact that there are multiple players, multiple organizations, so multiple departments, and also the policy decision-making process. In other words, the political decisions that have to be made, and these can be very delicate decisions that involve multiple factors, and the combination of all these elements tends to slow down military procurement, in addition to a relatively small industrial base in Canada, which reduces the number of bidders and competitors. So these are all factors contributing to delays.
So there are bureaucratic factors, and there are also political factors.
Yes.
Okay, that are with these delays. So we've got maybe 20 seconds left. How do we ensure that these lapsed funds and the non-inclusion in estimates of what's necessary to implement strong and secure and engage? What's one thing you could say in the 10 seconds you've got here to
I'd
get
say
it done?
Focus the minds, reduce the number of players involved. It's less than 10
Mr.
seconds.
Kelly? Good advice. Focus the mind, reduce the number of players. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. I've met with Canadian industry. In my writing, I have a pretty big aerospace industry, and so they have, CAE, and there's Bombardier. There are several companies that have worked with the government and who have received contracts in the past. And a major complaint that they have is that we often go towards the outside and towards other countries instead of domestically procuring some of the equipment that we use in our Canadian Armed Forces. And they actually met with the minister recently, and one of the reasons that the minister gave was the fact that different countries who are all part of NATO have to have similar equipment when they're training, and when they're when they're working together. So first of all, can you confirm that this is, I guess, a factor that's taken into account when looking at where to procure from and which equipments will be required from our Canadian Armed Forces?
So it's clear that interoperability with our major allies is an important factor in design specifications. We obviously want our military equipment to be able to operate alongside our allies. So it may or may not be a factor in some or in all of our military procurement projects. But beyond that, I think the minister herself and her officials would be best placed to answer in more details as to the extent to which this is a limiting factor.
Thank you. Can you compare are there other countries that you are aware of, or how does Canada compare to other countries in terms of domestic procurement versus external procurement? Do you know if other NATO countries, for example, I guess in the G7, even G7 countries, how they compare to Canada in terms of reinvesting in their own industry?
Based on my knowledge, it seems to be broadly similar. Of course, there are exceptions for big countries like the US, which has a strong, wide military industrial base. But for other smaller countries, it is broadly similar to Canada.
Okay. So yeah, the industry does feel that if we don't at least prioritize them in terms of contracts, then other countries are also going to have difficulty going towards them because they won't feel they have the credibility because their own country isn't preferring them. And by doing this, then we're kind of only making it worse because the small base that exists in Canada is only going to be getting smaller and smaller. Is there no way that, you could see a potential way to help change that? Is there no way that there could be better communication perhaps between the government and industry in order to really show, this is what we need. These are what our needs are going to be. This is the vision we have going forward. And, we would like to prioritize you. Also, they feel that because there's this interoperability that you're mentioning, if we were to choose and see that Canada produced something great, then we can also promote it abroad, and then we can have some of our Canadian technology, which is, pretty good technology. We're pretty good in this, especially in the aerospace area. Can kind of help in that way. What are your thoughts on this?
I think you raise a very good point that if Canada does not rely on its domestic producers, it becomes difficult for them to be credible when they try to sell their products abroad if their own national government is not even depending or relying on them to equip its armed forces. So that leads to difficult decisions at the political level as to when and what to procure and who to ask to supply the Canadian forces. Do we go with the lowest bidder, or do we go with the lowest bidder or a Canadian producer to ensure that this becomes a national champion or a nationally recognized supplier, which can then become also recognized by other armed forces abroad and export its products. So it's a delicate balancing act.
Thank you, Madame Lambropoulos. Colleagues, we've been very efficient. Thank you to our witnesses, and for the first time I can remember, actually got 2 full rounds in the time allotted. So I'm, that we are intending to go in camera after this. So I just want to canvass the room as to whether you want to go for a third round. If we shrunk the round to, say, 3 minutes and 1, is that of interest? Because these are valuable witnesses here. Would that work? Are we ready for that? Okay. If that's all right with you and you're not going to charge us overtime, it's 1 coffee, that's the price. Okay, Mr. Clerk, if you could attend to the coffee needs. So with that, we'll start the third round, 3 minutes. Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank PBO for being with us today. You mentioned a couple of times now about reducing the number of players and having 1 point of ministerial accountability, 1 senior civil servant to also be in that accountability chain. So who would you eliminate off the team to streamline it, and what role can PCO play in helping oversee and coordinate defense procurement and speed up that process?
So I'm agnostic as to who should be in the driver's seat, so to speak, as long as it's somebody with the right expertise and the right knowledge and is well supported by officials with the sufficient number of officials, and the right skill set. When it comes to a coordination role, in my experience, whenever there is a group or a task force or whatever you want to name it that's housed at PCO, the Prime Minister's department, it tends to focus the minds in the public service, and it tends to signal that the issue is very important to the Prime Minister and to the clerk. So having a coordination group or a responsible secretariat within the Privy Council office, which is the Prime Minister's department, usually tends to signal to the entire bureaucracy that the issue is very important, and it tends to make things happen and make them happen as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Thank you very much. The other issue is, and we were even talking about, is the ITBs. So Industry Canada is responsible to ensuring the ITBs are actually taking place. Are they policing it to ensure that there's dollar for dollar value? And are they making sure that it's actually creating high skilled jobs and expanding our industrial base, or has it become more of just a shell game and moving money between different companies? Could end up in buying a potato farm in Manitoba, for example.
Well, I can certainly say that ISED has personnel that verify every transaction that are under defense contracts to ensure that there's no double counting, that these funds are actually spent. And with regards to the creation of employment and these aspects, the economic activity aspects, they use a modeling approach to estimate that. So it's not a situation where they're counting X number of jobs are created in this such and such a locality. It's estimated via models.
Do I still have any time left, Madam Chair?
Environ 20 secondes, Monsieur Bezan.
About 20 seconds.
So the final question I'd have then is, if we are talking about creating a sovereign capability within our defense industrial base, so the policy should be then buy Canadian whenever possible and only off the shelf when we don't have an affordable Canadian option. Would that be in your estimation, based upon all the work that you guys have done over the years on defense procurement?
Well, that seems to already be the case to a certain extent, but that's a policy decision that's outside of my realm, but that is one possible approach.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. May, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. A PBO report on progress under Canada's defense policy, Strong, Secure, and Engaged, noted that delays in capital spending and a shift in expenditure to later years. This shift is expected to mean that project costs will be higher than initially projected. At the same time, a recent D&D internal audit noted a large portion of unfilled positions for procurement professionals, and noted competition with the private sector as a main driver. In your opinion, sir, could spending more on ensuring national defense has the capacity it needs actually save us money in the long term to by helping to avoid project delays that lead to these cost increases?
A number of military procurement personnel at D&D and PSPC is certainly one factor explaining the delay in procuring some major equipment, but it's not the only one. So increasing the number of procurement personnel, I think, is probably necessary, but may not be sufficient in ensuring that the pieces of equipment that D&D needs for its forces would be procured on time and within budget. So necessary, but probably not sufficient. There are other issues at play, such as capacity in Canada for domestic production, for example.
Thank you. The PBO conducted an analysis on the industrial and technological benefits policy last year. Can you maybe go through a little bit more what the main findings of that analysis was?
So we found that there was some issues with the ITB. We looked at a limited period of time. The ITB was in place since 1986. So we looked at a period that started, if my memory serves me well, in 2015. And we found there was about $18 billion in ITB. The majority of these ITBs were to larger corporations. Only less than 20% of ITB went to small and medium-sized businesses. And we also found that there is, despite the fact that there's a multiplier which gives credits between 4 to 9 times the amounts actually spent to the businesses themselves, if they spend in categories that are high value, such as post-secondary education and R&D, only 5% or so was effectively spent in these categories, despite the fact that they get between 4 and 9 times the value in credit towards meeting their targets in ITB. So these are in a very short, a high-level summary of the findings on our ITB report.
Thank you, Mr. May. 1 minute, Madame Normandin.
J'aimerais entendre un
I'd like to hear a general comment on the issue of cyber, because we are completing this study with regards to the life cycle analysis or the challenges that this creates for the PBO, that this technology is evolving so fast, and oftentimes we're trailing behind technological advancements. Yes, this is a sector or a zone that we have not studied in detail, so unfortunately I don't have any important comments to make on this issue. I'm sorry. Thank you. That's all right.
Efficient and excellent question. Madame Matheson, 1 minute.
Just, I guess, to conclude, so I put forward a PMB, Bill C-300, trying to get at what we were discussing in terms of that money that is supposed to go into Canadian hands at source, finding its way into sort of more of the foreign, larger corporate and international hands. Is there really anything... because we talk about like the spin-off jobs in my city, right? In my constituency, there's a very large contractor, but it's the smaller spin-offs. Is that considered within a lot of these projects, within your analysis? And is it just more of the hardware, or were you looking as well at like training and education and some of the companies that were doing that work?
So our reports so far have focused on the expected costs of procuring these major pieces of equipment. We have not looked at the spin-offs or the economic benefits or the industrial benefits, because in and of themselves, the major procurement projects we have looked at are massive and they require quite a bit of analysis. And essentially our capacity to do that analysis sits on to my left, and there's some help that we get in the office, but he's by and large like the bulk of our capacity.
Okay.
Mr. Yes, please. Three
I'm
minutes.
up?
Yeah.
Okay, it didn't come through. Sorry about that. So let's go back to the issue of, you're looking at where the government has allowed money to lapse, and you're saying that it's $2 billion just on capital spending this year. There's a $4 billion delta in the upcoming difference between the departmental plans and the main estimates. So as these numbers continue to reduce overall defense spending, how much is that impacting upon the numbers and forecasts that you've done on Canada meeting the 2%? You already said that over the next 5-6 years, there is a $75 billion shortfall between 2% GDP and what was planned. Are we adding in now another $10 billion plus on top of that $75 billion?
So it's clear that when we have a shortfall in capital spending, that likely reduces the ratio and the pace, or it further takes us away from reaching the 2% target for the NATO target. But it also has another impact. So if you don't spend money now and you spend it the same amount in the upcoming years, with inflation, and especially inflation specific to the Department of, or to the defense sector, it reduces the absolute value of that money. So if you spend $4 billion now versus spending $4 billion in 5 years, you can buy less gear with the same billions of dollars 5 years from now due to inflation. So it also impacts the capacity of DND to acquire the pieces of equipment, be it military bases, equipments, barracks, and so on. So in the absence of an increase in the overall amount, delaying also has a detrimental impact on the value of what you can buy.
So defense inflation is similar to the Canadian average, or is it much higher? And how much does that erode the buying power of the Canadian taxpayer? Or how much more is it going to cost the Canadian taxpayer to get the same kit?
It's actually quite dependent on which type of materiel is being considered. In the case of naval shipbuilding, for instance, you'll see defense inflation rates between 1.2% and 4%. If it's for land vehicles, it's right in line with the economy. So it does vary, but as a general rule, it's a few percentage points higher.
Okay, so if we're running at 4.2% or where the inflation is right now, we could expect it somewhere between 4% and 6% is what you're saying?
Correct.
At this point in time. In the F-35 study that you guys are doing right now, are you taking a hard look at what that inflationary cost was from making the decision to purchase, 10 years ago versus the purchase now, and when the fighter jets are actually procured?
Unfortunately, we won't be considering the difference or the money lost, I suppose, had we procured sooner. But you're right, there is some amount there.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Final question, Mr. Souza.
Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Can you tell me what the balance of trade is between Canada and the other NATO countries in the military industry?
That's an interesting question, and I say that because I don't have the answer, unfortunately.
The reason I'm asking is we're often chastised for the percentage of spending by NATO, and yet we're being, in some respects, being told by the very producers that we buy from, right? So there obviously is an interest in them procuring, or we procuring from some of these major markets. But my suspicion is, and I think you've alluded to this now a number of times, is that Canada has a small critical mass. We're unable to compete effectively on some of the big projects. Consequently, we are reliant on foreign support. But at the same time, we're trying to do and procure locally to provide some sovereignty issues on our part. But then how much of our local producers are selling abroad? Do you have a sense?
No, I don't have a sense, but I know there are areas of excellence that exports. It's been widely reported in the media for some of these years, but I don't have an overall number as when it comes to the balance of trade in the military area.
Be nice to know. In regards to the actual procurement process, you talk about being more focused and having fewer individuals, but the complexity of these projects are substantive. Treasury Board is going to be required in order to allot the required funding. How is that going to actually make procurement that much more simpler when in fact you're going to end up going through the same process anyway?
Well, I think if you have the one ultimately decision maker responsible as opposed to having two or even more than two, it reduces the number of steps if they can sing from the same songbook at the beginning, as opposed to having interdepartmental meetings and meeting after meeting and have different processes in two different institutions. That can streamline things. But you're right. If you have the right persons, despite having the wrong governance structure, if you have the right persons, sometimes it can work. But it helps to have the right governance structure in place to streamline things to the extent possible.
I appreciate that. If there's more time, I just wanted to understand the political undertones here, because the sovereignty issues, the notions of trying to support other issues beyond the diplomatic stuff, I guess I can put it that way, you can't determine that on occasion. So that's where the complexity comes into play. Anyway, I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Souza. Surprise, surprise, a former finance minister defends Treasury Board. First time in history anyone's defended Treasury Board. With that, I just wanted to thank our witnesses. You have launched this study brilliantly, and we really do appreciate it. You've directed us to the critical questions that need to be asked. So thank you for not only your hour, but your hour and 15 minutes. So with that, colleagues, I'm going to adjourn, but for those who are online, I thought it was adjourning. But in order to be able to change over, you don't have to? Just to suspend. Okay, apparently I'm suspending.
You can adjourn if you want.
No, that would not be a good idea. So For the benefit of the colleagues online, which is why I thought we had to adjourn, is that you have to leave the meeting. In your memo, there is a second set of instructions as to how to sign in, and the sooner you do that, the sooner we can get on with the in-camera portion of our meeting. So with that,
Appreciate it.
the meeting is suspended.
you.